And it's my great pleasure to have as our first speaker, Andrew Barto, who is the father or even the grandfather of the field. And we're very happy to learn more about surprise, curiosity, and evolution. Andrew, please go ahead.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I would love to see everyone when I talk. It's unusual for me to speak into the screen, but I will try to do my best. I had some difficulty preparing this talk because I didn't quite know what I should talk about, and I wasn't sure what kind of audience there was. So I'm assuming that not everyone is familiar with some of the basic aspects of reinforcement learning. Many of you are, so forgive me, I'm going to do a very quick introduction to that. And I should say also that I'm not an evolutionary biologist, and some of the things I say may be very well known among that group, but I'm going to talk about reward primarily, and some of the things that the reinforcement learning framework has impressed upon me about how to think about rewards, not just for machine learning, but also in the natural world. So the basic outline, I'm going to do a little introduction to machine learning, placing reinforcement learning in that context. And then I will talk about reward from a reinforcement learning perspective, and then talk about evolutionarily optimal reward signals. And finally, if there is time, novelty and surprise, although I probably won't get that far. So let's begin with a little introduction. And again, many of you are familiar with this, but bear with me. So in the context of machine learning, we have supervised learning, which is learning from labeled examples, sometimes called learning with a teacher. There's unsupervised learning, learning from unlabeled examples. One objective is to cluster items into clusters. And then reinforcement learning is different from both of those, sometimes called learning with a critic, and basically learning to increase the amount of reward and decrease the amount of penalty. So these little pictures show critics. These critics are evaluating a performance as it's going on, giving reward and penalty information by just their facial expressions, whereas this critic writes up a column in the newspaper the next day or the next week. So it's a very delayed evaluation of the performance. And both of these are reinforcement learning algorithms deal with both of these. A lot of work is involved in dealing with delayed evaluations. So let me begin by pointing out something that helps to clarify things. The distinction between rewards and reward signals. These are quotations from Wolfram Schultz's Scholarpedia article. Rewards are objects or events in the world that make us come back for more, whereas reward signals are produced by neurons in the brain. And I think it's important to recognize that the reward in reinforcement learning really corresponds to a reward signal. It's not, doesn't represent an object or an event. So let me refine the usual picture of reinforcement learning. This is the sort of standard agent interacting with an environment, receiving state information, producing actions, and receiving rewards. And I've labeled them as coming from a critic, which I'm calling a primary critic, because these are really correspond to primary reward signals. But I want to refine this. And many of you, if you're working in reinforcement learning, understand this very well, but I'm not sure everyone does. I think it's instructive to split the environment into an internal environment, meaning internal to the organism or robot, whatever the case may be, splitting it into an internal and an external environment. And the critic, the primary critic, is in the organism, is in the robot. It's not in the environment. It's not in the external environment. Now this becomes the RL agent, and these become reward signals, not objects or events in the world. And then from the external environment come rewards and other sensations. This is a useful refinement. It doesn't contradict this, it just refines it, indicating that the internal environment within an organism or within a robot, if you're a roboticist, is the source of the reward signals that the RL agent has access to. Now, this is still very abstract though, because there are likely to be many RL agents and many channels for reward signals, but this still has quite a large level of abstraction. But this refinement into an internal and external environment, I think, is useful to impress upon us that in nature, the primary reward signals evolved over millions of years and are resident. They're generated by mechanisms within the brain of the animal. So now a few other words to define. Primary reward signals are those that include information necessary for survival and reproduction, such as food, sexual contact, escape, but many other things as well. And which is one of the points of this talk, is to talk about some of those many other things. And these other things are predictors of evolutionary success, and they're built in. Primary rewards are built in by the evolutionary process. So secondary reward signals derive their value from primary reward signals. They're predictors of primary reward signals, and they're learned by the organism. And then there can be higher order reward signals that derive their value from lower order reward signals. And so they're predictors of predictors, et cetera. And these are learned as well. And so these different types of reward signals play large roles in reinforcement learning systems and also in the natural world. So there's a situation where secondary or learned reward signals predict primary reward signals that in turn predict evolutionary fitness. And so the relationship between secondary and primary reward signals is similar to the relationship between primary reward signals and evolutionary fitness. So in a sense, primary reward signals are secondary to evolutionary fitness. So now there are many different types of reinforcement learning algorithms. Many of them include a secondary critic that produces through learning a higher order or learned reward signal. And this shows a common method for doing this using the temporal, the so-called temporal difference or TD predictor that learns a higher order reward signal on the basis of its being able to predict primary reward. And let me say a little bit more about TD learning here as somewhat of an aside. It's really an error correction scheme that involves an error signal, a TD error, as it's called. And this is an expression for it. And I'm not going to go into detail about this, but it's based on comparing current and older estimates of future primary reward together with the current primary reward signal if it's present. And as this iterates, eventually it approaches the value function, becomes a prediction of the sum of future primary reward signals. And this TD error is in, well, this is, if you're familiar with this literature at all, sometimes this delta sub t is written this way. It's one time step different. And in fact, in the book that Rich Sutton and I wrote, we use this expression, which really signifies that it's delta t is the error that's present at time t, but it's not available until the next time step. And I actually prefer this version, which is the signal at time t that's available for this algorithm. And that's important because in neuroscience, one of the most interesting correspondences between reinforcement learning algorithms and neuroscience is that this TD error has an uncanny correspondence to dopamine phasic responses in the brain. And as Schultz, Diane, and Montague wrote about in their 1997 science paper. So this TD error does a reasonably good job of modeling the phasic responses of populations of dopamine neurons. Not all of them, but many of them. So to me, this is very exciting correspondence. It made a connection between the theoretical algorithmic reinforcement learning and the brain. So to me, this was a kind of an outcome that really increased my interest in the whole subject. So now going back to the main thread here, I want to talk about evolutionarily optimal utility functions. I'm using the term utility, it's used in economics. I stumbled upon a paper in theoretical economics by Samuelson and Swinkles called Information, Evolution, and Utility. And they asked the question, given that successful descendants are the currency of evolutionary success, why do people have utility for anything else? And this inspired us to do some computational experimentation on this question. And so working with Satinder Singh, Rick Lewis, and Satinder student Jonathan Sorg, we did a large number of computational experiments and published several papers that talk about these results. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just sort of hit some of the high spots of what we were able to learn from this work. So at the high level, how we thought of this is that at one level, that it's really a bi-level optimization problem. At one level, learning has the objective to maximize primary reward. And an outer loop is evolution, whose objective is to maximize evolutionary fitness. However that's defined. We didn't really care how it's defined. We created a surrogate to play that role. So this is So bi-level optimization has been studied, has been proposed and studied, and there are many instances of bi-level optimization where an outer optimization level includes within it an inner loop, an inner optimization problem. But this one, to the best of my knowledge, is different because the upper level decision vector, in other words, what this level is searching over, includes the lower level objective function. So this is you know, that the primary reward function of an animal is the result of evolution, so that the objective function of the inner optimization is being adjusted by the outer loop. And to the best of my knowledge, this property is not, at least it's not a standard property of bi-level optimization procedures. So what we did, we worked in a framework where there's an RL agent A, there's a space of reward functions. There'd be a space of primary reward functions R, and a set of environments and a probability distribution over those environments. And given a reward function, R in big R, and a sample environment sampled from this distribution, obtain a history, H. So it's the whole lifetime of a reinforcement learning agent learning in the chosen environment and using a particular reward function. Then there's a fitness function that evaluates the whole history. So capital F is analogous to evolutionary fitness. We didn't use genetic algorithms or any sort of evolutionary program. We just did brute force search in this space of reward functions for reward functions that, when used by the agent to support learning, generated high fitness when its whole history was evaluated by capital F. So an optimal reward function is a reward function R star that maximizes expected fitness over the distribution of environments. And clearly R star depends on the agent, the space of reward functions, and the set of environments and the distribution over those sets. So what we did in these simulations is ran many instances of an agent, actually many different kinds of agents, running in environments sampled from this space of environments to estimate the expected fitness over the distribution. So we were able to, now I should say the environments we chose were just simple sort of foraging environments, and we used as a proxy for evolutionary fitness this capital F function, just how much food they were able to acquire over a lifetime. And typically these were long lifetimes, but finite bounded lifetimes that each agent was run and that allowed the fitness to be computed after the end of their life to produce this F of H. So that was sort of the framework that we worked on, and we found a number of interesting things. At least interesting to me. Now, maybe many of these things have been well known by evolutionary biologists, perhaps economists also, but for us working with reinforcement learning as computer scientists, these observations were very interesting, some of them unexpected. First of all, reward and fitness functions were not related in a simple way. it's not the case that it's easy to predict what the optimal reward function should be for a particular class of environments and evolutionary fitness function. The best reward function is sensitive to, well, obviously to the fitness function, to the environment and the agent and its boundedness, meaning the agent has limitations on what it can sense, what it can represent, what it can compute. And this turns out to be critical. A good reward function might reward actions and events that are not directly related to fitness. In fact, the gap may be hard to fathom how a particular primary reward signal contributes to fitness. Reward functions can attenuate negative consequences of various types of agent bounds. And this actually, we can see this very easily in terms, say in food, we can't sense directly, say, the nutritional value of food, but our reward functions give us rewards based on taste, and that can mitigate the negative consequences of having to try in our own lifetimes to eat all kinds of things just to see if something might be nutritious or not. So this is an important property of a high quality reward function. And interestingly, an agent's objective may not be the same as the designer's objective. So the agent will be trying to maximize the evolved reward signal. That's its objective, and it may be distantly related to the fitness function, but evolution over long periods of time has adjusted the reward function in order to make it compatible with the fitness function. So in addition, a good reward function might encourage what Daniel Berline, who's a primary psychologist who studied curiosity and exploration, he called epistemic behavior that augments knowledge. And a good reward function might encourage what he called ludic behavior, any behavior that does not have a biological function which can be clearly recognized. So ludic means play. Play has always been kind of a puzzle to many because it didn't seem a lot of controversy over what its biological function was. But from the point of view of this evolutionarily optimal reward functions, ludic behavior can be extremely useful from an evolutionary point of view. So behavior like these have been called intrinsically motivated, which are done for their own sake rather than for an externally supplied reward. And remember, these reward signals are coming from mechanisms within the brain of the organism or of the robot. They're not necessarily produced by external events or objects. So Berline, a little bit more from Berline. There was actually many years ago, science paper, Curiosity and Exploration. And here's a quotation from it. It's a little cryptic, but let me read it. As knowledge accumulated about the conditions that govern exploratory behavior and about how quickly it appears after birth, it seemed less and less likely that this behavior could be a derivative of hunger, thirst, sexual appetite, pain, fear of pain, and the like, or that stimuli sought through exploration are welcomed because they have previously accompanied satisfaction of these drives. So that's a complicated way of really saying that Um, exploratory behavior is primary, that rewards for exploratory behavior or motivation for exploratory behavior is built in by evolution. It's not learned. It's not a secondary or higher order behavior, but is primary. And actually, I think a good analogy is to relate it to basic research. So in some sense, these sorts of behaviors, which are supported by primary rewards, are analogous to basic research. So as Vannevar Bush, who really founded the National Science Foundation in the United States, this bolded part of this quotation, scientists doing basic research may not be at all interested in the practical applications, yet further progress would eventually stagnate if basic scientific research was long neglected. So it provides scientific capital, it creates the fund from which practical applications of knowledge must be drawn. And we can clearly see this now with the COVID virus pandemic. The vaccines that are coming out were not produced by, really the result of many, many years of basic research that investigated molecular mechanisms and other mechanisms without necessarily the goal of producing a vaccine, but really for their own sake. So these are instances of behaviors that generate primary rewards, but have a more indirect relationship to the upper level evolutionary objective function. Okay. Now I've lost track of time. How am I doing?
Oh, sorry, you're doing quite fine. You got another 6 minutes? Is that okay?
6?
6, yeah.
Okay. So now as computer scientists, AI researchers build reinforcement learning systems, there's a great challenge of designing reward signals. So the designer of the system really is playing the role of evolution in the account that I talked about. And they attempt to specify a reward function to produce the kind of behavior they want. And since it can be very difficult to do that. And it has generated lots of concern. For example, Nick Bostrom in his book on super intelligence talks about perverse instantiation, where you specify a reward function, or in general, an objective function for an optimization problem, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be. That was one of the interesting things about reinforcement learning for me, that these systems could really create behaviors that the designer of the system didn't anticipate. And I thought that was really cool. It was made them, it was very interesting. But there's a danger to it because they can produce behavior that is not good. So Norbert Wiener, founder of cybernetics, warned of this problem many years ago with this monkey's paw story. And I don't, it's not important to know that story, but basically it grants what you ask for, not what you should have asked for or what you intend. So it's very hard to specify through a reward function. It's very hard to specify a reward function that generates behavior that is what you really want. And more recently, Stuart Russell's new book, Human Compatible, actually has a lot to say about this danger of reinforcement learning. And he talks about the King Midas problem, where the king wanted gold, and eventually all his food turned to gold and his daughter turned to gold and so on. So, and this is a real problem with reinforcement learning. Okay, I think I'm going to go back here now to that paper in Theoretical Economics. Given that successful descendants or the currency of evolutionary success, why do people have anything else? And I think the answer is that people are bounded agents. They have limited abilities to sense, represent, model, plan, etc. So that you couldn't specify the evolutionary objective function as a reward function because it's inaccessible due to the bounds that the agent possesses. And I think this intimate relationship between outer loop evolutionary optimization, inner loop learning optimization, and boundedness of the agent, I think there's some very profound connections between all of those things that I think it really behooves us to understand as we think about learning in the context of evolution, both for thinking about the natural world and for designing artificial agents. Now, let's see. This just to remind us that rewards are objects or events, and reward signals are in the brain. This was produced by Will Dabney, one of my students, for a talk in Italy I did. And so it's just a visually interesting way of reminding us of this distinction between rewards and reward signals. So let me just end by thanking a lot of people. This is a subset of my students. Some of you may recognize them. Rich Sutton is here, Satinder. And I note particularly Phil Thomas and Bruno Castro da Silva because they are now assistant professors at the University of Massachusetts taking over the lab that Sutton, Rich, and I started many years ago and that I retired from almost 10 years ago. So they're continuing the reinforcement learning work at the University of Massachusetts. They're particularly interested in the safety of reinforcement learning systems, which is really something I talked briefly about, but there are lots of elements to that. So thank you very much. Now, are there any minutes left for me, or should I stop?
There are some minutes left.
Well, let me just mention something else then. So I worked with Marco Miroli and Gianluca Modassari in Italy, and we produced a paper called Novelty or Surprise. And it was published in Frontiers of Psychology. And this was motivated for me because of the so-called novelty responses of dopamine neurons. And we didn't know if they were really novelty responses or surprise responses. And so we looked carefully at the distinction between novelty and surprise. Surprise, basically, it's an emotion arising from mismatch between an expectation and what actually happens or what actually is observed. This is sort of the basic primal idea of surprise. Whereas novelty is that something's new, something hasn't been encountered before. It's not in memory. It's a different, it's very different than surprise, although often when something new occurs, it generates surprise, but it need not. And surprise can be generated by something that's very familiar. So these are actually different different things. And I think in looking at the kind of experimental results that generated the idea of dopamine novelty signals, we really concluded that they're actually surprise signals and not necessarily novelty. So I have a whole other talk here, but basically surprise it plays a key role in associative learning theories, where organisms only learn when there's some kind of discrepancy that generates surprise. And the Rescorla-Wagner model is a classic example of that, where there's an error between a composite expectation and what actually happens. And this is basically the delta rule, or the least mean squared algorithm. It's an error correction process. And the TD algorithm that I talked about similarly is an error correction process. And this TD error can be thought of as a kind of surprise, because it's a discrepancy between an old estimate and a new estimate. So it's consistent to think of dopamine neurons as exhibiting surprise, not necessarily for predicting reward, but predictions of other signals are quite possible as well. So now I can't go through, I should end, I think, but I wanted to mention, so Myron Tribus defines surprisal to be the negative log of the probability of something. And this is actually used as a measure of novelty also. And so our paper, which I will not, I'll have to stop, but we really talk about that notion of surprise, Bayesian surprise, other kinds of surprise, other theoretical definitions of surprise, and relate those notions to the kind of data that has generated ideas about how to think about dopamine neuron responses. So I'm going to stop here and maybe leave us with this picture. And I thank you for listening.
We need to thank you, Andrew. That was a very nice, very broad and general introduction to our topic. Thanks very much. So we now come to the questions. Let's see how that works. So we start with the questions that were upvoted or voted for most. So we have a question by Sandrine Hinrichs, and she asks, when you listed a couple of examples for primary rewards, Sandrine is wondering whether the drive to understand, that is the reward that comes with a reduction of surprise when something fits our internal model, is one of our most fundamental inbuilt primary reward systems. I think the real question is the last part of her question. What do you think? Is curiosity part of our primary rewards?
Okay, now answer, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Well, I think indeed it's primary. I think that's one of the points I was attempting to make. And Berline's quote really makes that point too, that these are primary, and they're sort of indirectly related to evolutionary fitness, but over the long term of a lifetime, certainly contribute to success in the evolutionary process. So indeed, I think curiosity, driven by exploration, drive, in general, a lot of so-called intrinsically motivated behaviors are motivated by primary rewards. So that's a very good question, and I think it's important to understand that those kinds of rewards are primary rather than learn. Of course, they can form the basis of learning secondary reinforcers and so on, but I think they're endowed by the evolutionary process.
let me thank you for your answer on behalf of Sandrine.
We have another question by Gaia Molinaro. How can we distinguish primary extrinsic rewards and intrinsic rewards within the RL framework? Both seem to be derived from an internal critique, no?
That's a very good question. So I've participated in a lot of discussion of that. In terms of the mathematics, where we use a symbol R for our primary reward, what generates that signal could be either extrinsic or generated totally within the robot or the organism. So I'm not sure the framework gives any help in distinguishing these things because they're blended together into the TD error. Actually, if it is a system that has a critic, the TD error has a primary reward part, and then it well, that's a separate issue. But both seem to be derived from the internal critic, and I think they are both derived from the internal critic. So
Okay.
I hope that kind of not a great clear answer, but the best I can do at the moment.
No, that sounds to be a very good answer. And here we have a similar question from Tangai Damat. I hope I pronounce this correctly. And the question is, homeostasis is an omnipresent phenomenon in living organisms and the main drive for action in animals. Oops, now this is gone. Wait. The question is not answered. It just disappeared.
I can still see it. Where is homeostasis expressed in RL? Isn't the action reward heuristic alone too simplistic to explain actions?
Well, actually, I got involved in reinforcement learning on the basis of the hypothesis that was expressed by Harry Clough that homeostasis is not the driving force of organisms. It's really, he coined the term heterostasis, meaning that they're really driven to maximize something or minimize something rather than to create an equilibrium. And so now I've written a lot about the difference between equilibrium seeking and extrema seeking. And to me, that's a key feature that distinguishes reinforcement learning, which is a maximization process, from an equilibrium seeking process like supervised learning, which is trying to zero out an error. And reinforcement learning is not working that way. So homeostasis is certainly an important property and a necessary feature of systems, but the feeling is that reinforcement learning is more relevant to the development of intelligence, whereas homeostasis is required to maintain the functioning of the mechanism. So that's a kind of brief answer, but I think reinforcement learning really emphasizes extrema seeking rather than equilibrium seeking.
Maybe we have a very short question with short question and short answer by Anis Nashar. And the question is, how did you define the space of reward functions?
Oh, that's a good question. Gee, let me see if I can remember. We defined it as, I believe, as linear combinations of various features of the environment. and we quantized it so that the search could be done in a brute force manner. And so basically the reward function was specified by various weights on features of the environment. And different, and then those coefficients would, optimal coefficients would come out of the search when we actually we exhaustively worked with everything in that space. These are small spaces just done to make the simulations possible. We didn't define the space of reward functions in any way that's really nicely related to the biological world. That would have been a further update to that kind of work. But thanks for that question. Yeah, it's a very good question.
Okay, thank you once more, Andrew. That was a very nice, very broad talk. And I think it's now time to move to our next speaker, who is Dirk Ostwald. And for this, Andrew, I think you need to quit your share screen.